So by about this time tomorrow afternoon, you'll probably forget 70% of anything new you learn here today. Wow, that's a pretty staggering fact. And it's a little bit shocking for us to consider that as vocational trainers, that there's a pretty solid chance that without the right interventions, that our students may forget up to 70% of what they've learned from our training sessions. Well, let's look at how we might reduce that number considerably. In today's session, I wanted to explore uh, the structure around vocational training. So you might recall from our previous session, actually the session before last, we went through a rapid fire session where I did over 20, in no particular order, over 20 vocational training techniques that could just be kind of, it's like a messy toolkit that you could pick up any one or two or three and put them together and to use them in your training sessions. It was something I'd been wanting to do for a while, is sort of have a collection of different techniques. And now building on that, I'd like to come back and go, well, let's now look at some strategies that we can use to put those together in more of a logical structure. And so we'll be doing that, and I'll make probably more of a focused nod towards Gagné's 9 events. So there's lots of different structures and things that we can use, but I think Gagné's 9 events is probably going back to TAE 101 stuff for a lot of you, but it's hopefully a good refresher. And it's probably one of the good, solid, foundational ways that we could structure a training session, and it's very transferable to different situations. And before we get into that, we'll also just review some things that have been talked about in previous sessions quite a bit, but to answer that question of what is learning, since that's what we're all here to do as vocational trainers, is to figure out how can we get a group of students to achieve a learning objective. So by answering that question of what is learning and what's going on in the brain when that's happening, if we can answer that, that will help us be much more informed and be able to provide a more effective learning experience for our learners. So this was the list from the previous session I mentioned. It's not in any particular order, and I won't go through these now, but just to remind you of some of the things that we talked about, everything from coaching and mentoring through to role plays and simulations, giving feedback, an ask it basket, using games in learning, videos. So these are just some of the many different things that we can use in training. And it's almost like a basket that you can just pick and choose from. But now let's talk about how we might put that into a bit more of a structure in today's session. Let's answer this question. What is learning? Well, learning is when we have something in long-term memory. Now, just for the people who are raising their hand, this is a webinar where I'm unable to, because of the numbers, I'm unable to provide a great deal of interaction with you. So I'll be checking in with the chat. We'll do a few questions and things shortly. But yeah, feel free to continue your discussions in the chat, but I just keep seeing the hand raising going up there. Sorry about that. I wish I could interact with you a lot more. So answering the question, what is learning? It's when we have something in long-term memory. And there's two types of long-term memory, well, there's other types, but we're just going to focus on these two main types of long-term memory, which is declarative and procedural. So declarative memory is when we know what something is, so recalling facts and figures. And procedural memory is when we know how to do something, so being able to perform a skill. So learning has been successful, typically in vocational education, when our learners know the right knowledge and know how to perform the skills as they relate to, say, a unit of competency. And this is going into the realms of psychology, but it's a well-documented process that covers off on things like cognitive load theory. It's basically the journey of going through three types of memory, from sensory memory, working memory, and then eventually into long-term memory. So it's so that it's declarative and procedural memory. And that's what we want. We want to make sure that journey is successful. Now, it's, of course, when we look at things like this, we're very much simplifying it. It's a hyper simplification of what's going on in our beautiful and complex brains that we have as humans. But we do need these kind of simple frameworks to help us understand what's going on. So the first thing that happens is sensory memory. And that's basically attention. So our students must, first of all, be able to be tuned in and recognize this as something that's important. So at any given time, our sensory memory is being bombarded, absolutely bombarded, and probably even more so. We have phones and we might be in shared offices and environments, or our students are in a classroom with lots of other students who they all have phones. There's sounds from outside. I was just momentarily distracted by a big helicopter that just came straight over the top. And I was thinking about, I wonder what kind of helicopter that is. No, Paul, stay focused on your training. So we're constantly bombarded by all these things that are trying to hijack our sensory and working memory. So to make sure that our sensory memory is doing what it's meant to, we must be able to recognize something as important. Once we've gotten the attention of our learners, we can then start to play with the working memory. Now, our working memory is very, very limited. This is building on some of the early work of George Miller, some 50, probably more than 50 years ago now, where he came up with that concept, that the magic number of 7, 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of things in working memory. So it's kind of like if I was to, read out several words like pineapple, helicopter, truck, water, screen, computer, telephone, and you were to try and remember those things, we'd probably start to forget once we got to that number, around 7 plus or minus 2. Some say it's considerably less, and of course some people practice it and can even go further than that. And it's also got a limited duration too, perhaps around 10 to 20 seconds. So it's a very limited memory, and things very quickly fall away and they're lost. And if, again, the sensory memory and the working memory play together, and if it's not considered important, or, especially if our attention is hijacked by something else, it is very, very quickly lost. So these are the limitations of the human brain that we have to work with as trainers. There's no other way. We don't know of any other ways of getting not like this kind of long-term memory happening without getting through the bounces of sensory and working memory. And then it gets even more complicated, because once we get from working into long-term memory, it's not just like, oh, okay, I've paid attention, so we'll let you in, we'll let you into the nightclub of long-term memory. It doesn't quite work like that. So there's this kind of interplay, this sort of backwards and forwards that happens between working memory and long-term memory. So for successful learning to happen, we need to be able to then rehearse or retrieve something that we've learned back from long-term memory and then use it again in our working memory. And so it's only through that practice, through rehearsal, through retrieving, and anything like that. So it could be practical activities, quizzes, exercises, discussions, all those kind of techniques that allow a student to bring something back from long-term memory and get it back into working memory and rehearse it like that, apply it to solve problems and so forth. So it's a very interesting part of what happens in our brains. John Sweller, who is an Australian, and he has pioneered a lot of research into cognitive load theory, which is kind of which is talking about basically the limits of our working memories. And so here's a quote from Sweller. He says that anything beyond the simplest cognitive activities appear to overwhelm working memory. So if you think about what we're doing right now, and dare I say, you may or may not have me open in another tab and probably have your phone and another screen going as well, and perhaps some colleagues sitting next to you in the office as well. And our cognitive load is already loaded up quite a lot just by our environment. So we're already kind of at a disadvantage when we've got our students in a room with us as trainers, and probably even more so when it's an online thing like this. But then once you start adding to that load, cognitive load is probably a whole session for another day, but just in its simplest form, we've already got an existing load that's happening around us with our distractions and environment. And then words on a screen, that adds to our cognitive load. Me saying something, that adds to the cognitive load. So it's in Sweller's theories, he's really saying that pretty much everything that we do, unless it's the most simplest cognitive activity, is probably going to overwhelm our working memory. And he goes on to say that any instructional design, so instructional design includes writing up lesson plans and designing courses, that flouts or merely ignores working memory limitations inevitably is deficient. So basically, when we forget that we have these incredible limitations in our working memories, or our students' working memories, then if we forget that, if we ignore that, then again, they're not going to learn, or they're going to miss key things. So we've got to come into this lesson today really being aware of these limitations of the sensory and working memory. Now, when we talk about the long-term memory, where we've actually learnt facts and are able to recall certain things and recall how to do a certain skill, we also have another disadvantage, another thing about our human brain that kind of puts us behind the eight ball a little bit. And that's a thing that was described first by Ebbinghaus in 1880, but has been repeated many times since in follow-up experiments. But it's commonly known as the forgetting curve or the Ebbinghaus curve. And that's not really a scientific picture that I've got there on the screen, but that basically indicates, remember the fact that I gave you at the beginning of the session, you know, that you may forget 70%. By this time tomorrow, you may forget 70% of anything new that you've learned today. So a lot of you are probably coming into this with a lot of prior knowledge. This might actually be a refresher for you. So it's not going to be the forgetting. What you're doing now is you're interrupting that forgetting curve from happening. So that's good. So we get this very rapid drop off, as you can see here with the dark blue line. And our up and down axis is the amount of knowledge that's retained, the things that we remember. And then the horizontal axis here is the period of time. And that's a very sharp drop. That's our sort of initial 24 hours after having learnt something. And then it very sharply drops off and then kind of flattens out over time. So what can we do about that? That's what we can do about it. We can practice. So just like in that earlier slide where I talked about long-term memory, that it's not about just simply, you know, getting through the hurdles of sensory memory and working memory, and then, oh, okay, I'll let you into long-term memory and you're there forever. No, as we can see in the picture, the forgetting curve means that that drops off very, very suddenly. But through rehearsal, through practice, which, depending on what's being learned, if it's merely just if we're learning knowledge and the theory sort of things, things like quizzes and activities, Q&A, discussions, group activities, those sorts of things can help to recall that knowledge. And of course, it goes for skills as well. So the ability to remember how to do something is part of long-term memory as well. So it still falls into this same picture. It's just a matter of practicing those skills. And what you might also notice in this picture is there's a gradual increase of time in between practice. So that's been studied quite a bit. If we gradually increase the period of time between practice, then the learning is more effective. It's more effective in interrupting forgetting. And so we can see here with each of those pink lines there that represent a moment of practice, that dotted line represents what would have happened if the practice didn't take place. So we need to be aware of this when we're planning for our training and our learning. We need to consider what opportunities our learners have for retrieval, to retrieve that knowledge from long-term memory, whether it be knowledge or skills or skills. So how to structure a vocational training session. So this picture here is something that I've used quite a bit. It's borrowed from Julie Dirksen, who wrote a book called Design for How People Learn. It's an excellent introductory book into instructional design, and I strongly recommend it. I think it's a really great read. But basically, as this picture here illustrates, this is kind of what most courses are like, whether they're online courses or done in the classroom. It's this like riding a bike up a very, very increasingly steep hill. So you have an intro, then module 1, module 2, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And if you're lucky, by module 3 or 4, you might still have some people actually still riding their bike, but many might have gotten off, and some might be trudging and walking, and others might have given up altogether. And then you get to the top and you've got your summary, and then it's all over. So that's kind of our sort of default assumption, and even me and many other experts will kind of find themselves in this situation where we forget that, and we default back to doing this. It's kind of like if we're not aware of it, if we forget, we find ourselves back in this trap of just kind of layering new and more information on top of each other, and it's not the best approach. So I think something like this is a better representation of how we might think about structuring our vocational training sessions in a simple picture. So we start off there. You can notice what's happening. The person on the bike, they're kind of coming into it on a bit of a downhill run. Let's have fun. So we're recalling prior knowledge. It's nice and easy. I'm thinking about things I've already done or experiences I've already had that might relate to the new stuff. So they've almost kind of got a bit of a running start, and then they hit their first hill. It's a pretty easy hill, but they're learning some new information or some new skills. And then once they've learnt those new skills, then they're having an opportunity for practice. So here's that interplay between working memory and sensory memory, and of course long-term memory, because we want to get this encoded into long-term memory so that we can interrupt forgetting, like in the forgetting curve. So we want another little downhill run where they have an opportunity to put those skills into practice, to practice those things, and to also, there's other things as well. There's all the emotional factors that come into it as well, like confidence. So once they feel like they're getting confident and oh, I've got this, I'm now at the point where I think I could do another one of those hills. I'm getting fitter. I'm getting stronger. Let's do it. And then so you might then introduce some more learning and some more new information and new skills and demonstrations and whatever it is. Okay, and then we have here an opportunity to apply that to maybe a different scenario. So they're transferring that learning. This is grossly overly simplified, of course, but it's just I guess a mental picture to help you understand how this might come together. When we launch into any kind of planning for our training and lesson plans, we must be very, very deliberate and specific about what we plan to achieve with our learners in a session. So we're going to be asking questions like, what do they need to know? You might say it in terms of what do they need to know by the end of this lesson? And what do they need to be able to do by the end of this lesson? And in doing that, of course, one of the things you will need to consider is, well, what do they already know and what can they already do that relates to it? Because that will kind of influence then some of your design decisions. So these are important questions to ask in crafting your objectives. I think developing clear learning objectives is a lesson for another day as well. There's a whole kind of art and science in that, but I think a good starting point is to look at things like the SMART model, SMART. It's very, very Googleable, and Google will, or any search will probably give you a really good structure of how to craft a SMART goal or a SMART objective. That can be a good, simple guideline. And it's all about just having a very, very concrete, a very clear description of what they need to know and be able to do. You can use verbs to describe that so that you can really clearly and accurately describe the behaviors. So, what does that person look like when they're doing this thing? And we'll see some examples in a little bit. A lot of this initial stuff, a lot of this early research into learning and things like Gagné's 9 events and everything, it was happening in an environment that was just after World War II. There was a whole lot of new technology, and a lot of this was done in kind of a military context. The computers were starting to kind of come about, and so when we're looking at a lot of this stuff, we kind of a lot of it ignored some of the social and emotional factors that we're really tuned into these days. So some additional things to think about in terms of what do they know and what can they do already are things like what keeps them engaged, what might keep my learners engaged, what structure, what reminders, what things like social and community can I build into my training sessions that might help them stay engaged? What might help them when things get difficult? So how do we avoid them from dropping out of the training? It might be things like support or rewards or other things like that. Again, social and community might come into it. How do we make it inclusive and culturally safe? So there are some other sort of additional questions that you might feed into your training sessions as well. Here's Gagné's 9 events of instruction. So you've probably come across this if you ever did your Cert 4 in training and assessment. It's probably one of the more common theories, I suppose, or frameworks that are looked at. So Gagne was in that kind of, post World War II time and was basically tasked with putting together a framework that could guide instructional designers in putting together training sessions to learn how to use weapons and technology and equipment and things like that. So the 9 events are attention, and I'll go into more detail in these. So gaining attention, stating the objective, eliciting recall of prior knowledge, then step 4, presenting your information, so your instruction and your demonstration. Then there's the things that you use for guidance. This can include scaffolding, any of those kind of supports and tools that you put into place to help learners understand things a little bit better. Event number 6 is practice, so the opportunity to actually practice what was learnt. He then adds in feedback, so the importance of feedback. Assessment, so checking that the skills were learnt. So that's going back to look at those objectives. And then 9 is transferring and retaining that knowledge. So Gagne recognized this whole issue of long-term memory and the forgetting curve, and emphasized that at point number 9. So it's not just about doing the assessment and we'll see you later, but giving people opportunities to practice that learning, to retain it and to be able to transfer it into perhaps more challenging or different environments. And of course, that ability is really important for vocational learners, because quite often what happens when they come and do our course, especially if we're in a simulated environment, is they get their certificate 3 or their diploma or whatever, and that qualifies them to do a job. But many of them have only had fairly limited exposure to the workplace. So we really do need to foster that ability to transfer what was learnt at our college to then be able to go and use those skills in real life to solve real world problems. So we'll now talk through these events in a little more detail, and I'm going to ask you some questions throughout there as well. And then I will bring it all together with an example. So here's the 9 events, just broken down a little bit more. So the first one is attention. So basically, Gagne recognized do you remember we talked about how easily distracted we are in our sensory memory, and how we're getting bombarded at any given time by all sorts of stimuli from our environment and from others and from the trainer. And we must get our students' attention. So there's all sorts of things that we can do to get students' attention. I'm going to ask you about that in a moment. We then state the objective. So just to be clear here at this second event where we're stating the objective, I'd really recommend stating the objective, because we're nerds for learning, aren't we? We're experienced professionals. So the way that we write learning objectives, we learn what I was talking about earlier, using the verbs and being quite descriptive, and we might refer to units of competency. Now, if you have a new group of vocational learners together and then you just go on training.gov.au and pop up the unit of competency and go, right, everyone, performance criteria 1.1, we're going to learn how to, and that's probably not a good idea. So I think when we're looking at Gagné's 9 events, stating the objective is more about stating it in their terms. So a good little trick is, I like to get students' attention by stating a problem and then talking about how the objective of today will actually give you the ability to solve that problem. So you've got their attention and you're stating that how this lesson, what you'll learn here now, will help you avoid that problem in future. Then the third event is recall, so eliciting retrieval of prior knowledge and experience. So that could be through many different ways. Actually, I'm going to ask you now. So what techniques could you use for gaining your learners' attention? Answer in the chat. Let's have a look. Okay. As always, the chat is filled with just so much wonderful discussions and chat amongst other experts, and I love that. Thank you so much. Here we go. So we've got, it must be thought-provoking questions involving the learner, giving them a hook or a brain teaser, showing a video. Yep, questions, quizzes. Quizzes, great. I think, yeah, thanks, Audrey. Starting out with a bit of a quiz. Nothing wrong with doing that. We often think that quiz is only meant for assessments. Stories, yep, more on stories. Games, awesome. Thanks, Mark. Practical experience, that's great. Gaining attention, scenarios, videos, questions. Project an image, a Kahoot quiz. Yvette, yes, absolutely. Yeah, Mindy, you've said my students love Kahoot. And oh man, I don't know why I resisted it for so long, but students love it. They really do, don't they? It's so much fun. It gets them really engaged. So if you haven't seen Kahoot, ask Yvette or Mindy for how to access it, and they might put it in the chat. Brainstorms are great. Examples, yeah, more on brainstorming, lots for questions, chalk and talk, nothing wrong with a bit of chalk and talk. Novelty, uncertainty, and surprise, Donna. Thank you. Oh, this, I can't keep up. I'm so sorry. I know all of you have had so many really great ideas here. Ivan uses the Mr. Bean episode. All right. And I think some of your answers there also tapped into that second part too, which is facilitating recall through things like quizzes and activities and go. So good. So you're thinking here. So there's many different ways. So this is where you start to build up a bit of a toolkit, and better than anything I could possibly offer in a webinar, you've got just this huge panel of, where are we now? 368 experts, experienced trainers are right now sharing their ideas for gaining attention and facilitating prior recall of knowledge. So definitely take note of what's happening in the chat. Thank you for that. So back to Gagné's 9 events. So we're just going to look at 4, 5, 6, and 7 together, because while this structure does kind of suggest a, like a step-by-step rigid kind of process, I don't think in practice it should be like that at all. I remember one learning professional referring to Gagné's 9 events as Gagné's 9 dull commandments. So it's like all these series, if we adhere to them too rigidly, and we find ourselves stifling creativity. So they're a really great way to get us thinking and to start to clue us into a good framework. But I think once you get the hang of it, you'll start to use these things a lot more dynamically than just going, all right, students, it's time to move on to stage 5, which is the guidance section. Okay, students, it's time to move on to stage 6, which is the practice session. It's a lot more dynamic. In fact, what would probably happen is you might start off with some instruction and demonstration. You'll use scaffolding and support during that, and then very quickly you'll go to practice. And then while they're practicing, you'll have to jump back into some instruction and demonstration. You'll need to provide further guidance. You'll be providing feedback. So, if I was to try and draw arrows on this, we'll end up with arrows all over the place, because it's kind of jumping backwards and forwards. And a good trainer, through their observational skills and everything else and feedback, they're watching what's happening with their students, and they can easily and elegantly dance between these events and integrate them together. But let's talk about them on their own so that we can make sure we understand them. So event number 4 is instruction and demonstration. So that's just good, classic, direct. We've had Dr. Zach Groeschel on the webinar last year, at the end of last year. And if you missed that, check out his recording on the resources section of our website. That was a really great session. He's right into this. This is really clear instruction and demonstration. And then we move into the guidance phase. So that is anything that basically provides scaffolding and support. Now, it's probably common that the guidance part is happening as part of instruction and demonstration and as part of practice. So anything that helps the learner understand things better. So mnemonics are really good. Like the DEDICT model, DEDICT. So DEDICT is a way of describing a skills-based training session: demonstrate, explain, demonstrate slowly, imitate, coach, test, and trial. So that's what we call a mnemonic. Now, people, when they just remember the word DEDICT, which is a made-up word, that is a scaffold or a support that helps them encode it into long-term memory. So any of those kind of things are really good in helping with your instruction and demonstration, and of course, helping with practice. So then we have event number 6, which is practice. That's, of course, giving people opportunities to apply what's been learned. And if that practice opportunity doesn't happen, as we saw in the previous slides, it's going to drop off, and we're not going to have that encoding into long-term memory. And then event number 7 is feedback. So giving feedback on performance during practice. So I had a session some time ago. Again, you can watch the recording on that, which offered some frameworks and structures for giving good feedback, because we can sometimes get a little bit caught up in just wanting to be nice and pump our learners up, because we know confidence is a really important part of this as well. But we need to also be able to provide that constructive feedback that provides guidance and correction, because they're learners. They are learners. They're learning. When we learn stuff, we make mistakes. When we make mistakes, we need guidance from someone who's strong and confident and who knows what they're doing to guide us into the right direction. So that feedback is really, really important. So over to you, just a couple of some of your thoughts in the chat, please. I'd love to know what some of your techniques you might use for guidance and scaffolding might be, as well as what techniques you use in your sessions for practice. Let's have a look in the chat. Okay, so we have here reflection, brainstorming, role plays. Thanks, Kayla. That's great. Yeah, role plays and demonstrations are really good. YouTube videos, real scenarios, case studies, simulations. Yep. Reflection, group discussions, presentations. Yvette, I wanted to capture this before it goes off the screen. Yvette, you said, always ask the student at the end of class what they learned, and in practice after the task, what did you learn? And what would you do better? That's really great. So targeted questions to help foster reflection. That's really good. Yep. Sarah, you've mentioned there that you like to demonstrate the wrong way and correct the mistakes. That's awesome. I love that. That's really good. And even when it's like a product-based training, when you may be teaching students, I think you might recall back some time ago, I had the case study of the lady who teaches cabinet making at TAFE. And when she's teaching the different types of woodwork joints, she has a bunch of unglued timber joints that she passes around the students so they can put the timber together and pull it apart. And she also includes some bad ones as well, so they can see what to look out for, and she can describe why they're bad. So you can look at it in both in terms of the product or the result of poor performance, or an actual skill, how doing it the wrong way is a bad thing and what to look out for. Very good. Direct observation, gamification, simulations again, lots of simulations is good, live examples, demonstrating. Yeah. So look, none of this needs to be fancy stuff. Like, this is just classic training. This is when we put it into a good logical order like this, it really, you start to see the magic happen. We can easily get distracted by technology and flipped classrooms and all these kind of fancy buzzwords, but at the end of the day, we're just encoding long-term memory, and we're just working with those limitations of the 5 senses, the human brain. So I think it's a lot of the same stuff, just packaged up in fancier ways. Very good. Thank you so much. And I love that one, Pawan. You've said working together on the first few examples. Absolutely. So that's that really good scaffolding, guided support, and eventually you start to remove that support as their skills and confidence increases. Fantastic. And somehow I've managed to put the number 5 there instead of the number 9, but that's just a check to make sure that you're paying attention. So event number 8 is assessment, which is like any good trainer does. We need to check and make sure that the learners have actually met the objective. So that's some kind of challenge that actually gives them the opportunity to use those skills and retrieve that knowledge to maybe solve a problem or to achieve something. And then 9, not 5, is retention and transfer. So as I said, very important for VET. What opportunities allow for ongoing application of the skills and knowledge? I think it would be good to see this in action. So I've actually got a bit of a case study here where I'm going to kind of tell the story of of a trainer's planning of how they basically plan their session. And we'll look at it, and we can use that as our kind of example of bringing Gagné's 9 events into action. Because I know sometimes when you see this of Gagné's 9 events, what that sounds really scientific and really complex, and there's 9 steps, and I can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 things. So maybe you're already playing with my working memory. So this just helps to emphasize how a lot of these events happen together at the same time. There's an interplay between them, and sometimes we go back and we review them. But just to, if you were previously unaware of Gagné's 9 events, or you'd forgotten about them, I think you'll find that when you see this brought into action, you'll go, ah, I already do that. So there's nothing particularly groundbreaking in this for most good trainers. So this is an example of a unit of competency, SIS OSN K001 snorkel. Yes, I found a unit of competency that has a title of just one word. So snorkel is used as a verb here. It's a real unit. I don't know if anyone else knows of a one-word titled unit of competency in vet. I'd love to know, but this is the first time I've seen a unit with one word as its title. Okay, so we have a trainer who is putting together a lesson on that relates to the unit snorkel, and they have put together their lesson plan. I've just got an overly simplified kind of template here for a lesson plan. And in the morning, they're going to get together at 8 o'clock, 8 a.m. And in the first 5 minutes, their first objective is they want to help their students to understand why water is cleared from the snorkel and the mask when it's flooded, when they're snorkeling, and to understand the overall objectives for today's session. And so the way that the trainer does that is by telling a story and explaining the objectives. So here's the events that are used here. So gaining attention. So what the trainer does is he starts off the session and he says, right, so they're all learning to be tour guides, okay? And this is where they're learning to snorkel so that they can take people on snorkeling tours. And they say, right, imagine that you've got a group of people that are on your guide, and you've taken them out to the Great Barrier Reef, and you notice all of a sudden this beautiful turtle just comes along right near the boat. And so everyone jumps in, but one of the people on the tour guide, they go in, they put their head under, and their snorkel is flooded with water, and their mask is flooded with water, and they come up and they're coughing and spluttering, and they're starting to panic. And of course, they scare the turtle away. And so a story like that, I probably told it really badly, but a story like that is helping the learner to, it's getting their attention. So they're thinking, whoa, I don't want to scare away the turtles when I'm a tour guide. So how can I solve this problem? And that's when our trainer says, right, today we're going to learn how to avoid that situation by learning some simple skills that you can use to clear the mask and the snorkel of water once you put your head underwater. So they've gained attention and they've stated the objectives. They've explained them in simple terms. Let's look at what happens next. So their objective now for the next 10 minutes is to recall any previous learning that they've had on mask fitting, and they've also had a previous bit of training on breathing techniques. So just straight in, see, you're right on top of it. In the chat already, you talked about discussion questions. I think it was probably the most frequently mentioned word in the chat that I saw before. And so here, where we can see the Gagné's third event, which is facilitating recall. And they're using discussion and questions about that. So remember the previous session where we talked about getting a nice snug fit on the mask? Do you remember we talked about the nice, relaxing Zen breathing techniques? You're going to need that here today. You're going to have to use those same skills today to be able to progress into this next stage. What does our trainer do next? Let's have a look. So in the next 15 minutes, their objective is they want their learners to understand the techniques for clearing water from the mask and snorkel. So we can see there the verb they've used is understanding the techniques. So they don't have to demonstrate them just yet. And the trainer's delivery method is they're going to use an on-land briefing and demonstration of the techniques. So they're not in the water yet. Then he's going to jump in the pool and do a demonstration in there, and he's going to emphasize the feel and the sound of successful clearing. He's going to talk about, he's using this kind of saying of don't blow out the candle like on a birthday cake. We're going to blast the candle out. That's a big boom. And then he's got some waterproof cards with diagrams that they can take into the water with them as well. So what of Gagné's 9 events are being done here? Well, we've got number 4, instruction and demonstration, and we've got 5, which is guidance. So the kind of device of blowing out the candle or blasting out the candle is a type of scaffold, and of course the waterproof cards with diagrams is a type of scaffold. Then from 8:30 to 9:30, the trainer's objective is that he wants the participants to clear the water from their mask and snorkel in the deep end of the pool. So that's what he wants from the learners. So to do that, the trainer gets them in the shallow end of the pool, and he gets them to practice the techniques that were just demonstrated with support and feedback. So he starts off by getting them to let a little bit of water into the mask, and clearing it out and checking that that's been done. Great. Okay, you did well. Now let's let a little bit of water into the snorkel. Let's clear that out. Okay, now let's gradually increase the amount of water into the mask, gradually increase the amount of water into the snorkel, try clearing that out. Now, so again, remember we've got the bike going up the hill. We're now going to try clearing the water from both the mask and the snorkel at the same time. And once the trainer has observed that this has been done successfully in the safe and shallow end of the pool, he gets them doing the same thing, repeating it down in the deep end. Okay, so we've got that bicycle going up and down the hill like that. And then finally, it ends with a diving challenge where he throws the rings into the deep end of the pool and they've got to dive under and they've got to retrieve the ring, come up, clear the snorkel and mask and so on. So what of the events are happening here? Well, we've got a real interplay. This is where they start to merge in together and kind of almost like a cycle. And really, he's probably going to be doing some of step 4 and 5, which is the demonstration and guidance as well. So there's probably actually 5 events happening all in this one hour practical session. So there's practice, there's feedback, and then there's the assessment with the diving activity at the end. And there's a bit of a kind of a loop happening there until the objective has been achieved. And that diving activity is what the trainer is using to gauge whether that objective has been achieved or not. Now, what about the 9th event? Well, this is where the objective is basically the same as it was before, but now he wants them to clear the water from the mask and snorkel in the actual ocean, in a shallow reef. So this is transferring the skills that were assessed as being successfully done in the pool in a more controlled environment. And now we're going to transfer those skills and use them in a slightly more challenging environment. Now we're out in the water, the ground isn't as even, it's got varying depth. The water might be a bit choppy, it might slop over the top of the snorkel, but they're going out for a group snorkel. They're going to have fun too. We've got an hour and a half of snorkeling on the reef. It's beautiful. And they're going to finish with a reflection and discussion about the experience. They're going to talk about their favorite moments, any challenges they had. So this all helps to facilitate the transfer and retention. And then, of course, we can imagine with a session like this, tomorrow when they come back or whatever, they might go and learn even some more advanced techniques in a more challenging environment. So you can see there that the Gagné's 9 events, there's no rocket science. It's just good, simple training, but it just helps us to put a bit of structure into a training session. So here's our review of today. We talked about learning being this process of going from our sensory memory into short-term memory and then into long-term memory. And that we need to be able to get it back out of long-term memory and retrieve it and use it and practice it for it to become, to sort of stick, to stay as long-term memory. So it's that process of interrupting forgetting, because if we don't do that, the forgetting will happen. That's just the way our brains work. And then we looked at an example of structuring a session using Gagné's 9 events. Thank you so much for sticking around for the session today. I've really enjoyed sharing this lesson with you. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Everyone frequently asks about the certificate, so we'll typically get those to you where it's Thursday. So I would aim to get those certificates to you by the weekend. Can you please wait until early next week if you haven't received it by then and you did stay for the entire session or for 80% of the session? Please do let me know, but please wait until early next week. They do take a little while to get out. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I hope this has been helpful, and I wish you all the best out there in your training session planning.